convicted murderer Oscar Pistorius will be released on parole under strict conditions today. The Blade Runner became eligible for parole in March of last year after serving half of his 13-year sentence. He was convicted for the 2013 murder of his girlfriend Reeva Steenkamp. His release was officially approved in November. There's mixed reaction to this parole, especially from the anti-GBV community. Joining us now is GBV activist Sibongile Ndashe, who is also the executive director from the Initiative for Strategic Litigation in Africa. A very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, welcome to Newzroom Afrika. You are of the view which is quite different to what many may be saying because of the mixed reaction of Pistorius' release on parole. Perhaps let me ask you what your view is.
He has served his time, and I understand the public sentiment based on the scourge of gender-based violence that we have in this country, and that many people complain that prison sentences are often not long enough. But if we go back to the history of this case and the basis of the conviction that he got from the Supreme Court of Appeal, when you look at the kind of intention that the court said this was about, the court does not go as far as say that he intended to kill Reeva. You know, they say whoever it was that you thought was in the bathroom, that's the person you intended to kill. And I do think that this is a distinction that we need to draw when we're talking about gender-based violence, right? Because where gender-based violence comes from is not all matter of women. We're talking about a form of violence that is directed at women because they are women. So when we talk about domestic violence, you know, when we talk about sexual violence, this is the category, you know, of offenses that constitutes gender-based violence.
Yeah, femicide.
Yes. Well, femicide is the killing of women, you know, so the intention is not it does not determine, you know, what it is. But gender-based violence, why in human rights language we decided it was because there are causes of gender-based violence, there are consequences. We're talking about people in abusive relationships, we're talking about the control, what society expects women to do, and the way in which sometimes it is normalized, you know, that while people may not necessarily agree with murder, but they can actually understand why a man would kill a woman who cheats, you know, or a woman who does other things to her. So gender-based violence came in to correct that, you know, to say that these are crimes that are, they are for women. So everyone gets killed in this country, you know, we see that, but it is because they are women. And I think that is one of the things that is important when we're having a conversation about these things, because the Supreme Court did not go as far as saying this was a gender-based violence. You know, it's
under Judge Masipa at the time, yes.
No, Judge Masipa is at the High Court. Remember, we have, there are
but she was also she was criticized for not having singled out gender-based violence.
Exactly, yeah. But what happened is that decision was appealed, right? And it went to the Supreme Court of Appeal twice. First, where they changed the conviction itself from culpable homicide to murder, and then from the initial prison sentence to the 13.5-year sentence. But in all of these things, right, what we don't get is this idea that the court comes to the understanding. There was a lot of evidence, right, about the nature of their relationship, the text messages and all of that. But the court doesn't talk about gender-based violence. They are saying this dolus eventualis that became the main term at the time. It's that you reconciled yourself with this idea that whoever was in the toilet is the person that you intended to kill, whether it was Reeva or this intruder that you thought was in the house. So in this kind of public sentiment, you know, because we have a country that is dealing with femicide, people out there are outraged, right, that this has happened. And we have seen the abuse of parole conditions, you know, in this country. By the parole board, we saw the medical parole that has been granted to some politicians, you know, at some point. So there is that idea that famous people as well. You know, this fame can be a double-edged sword, that sometimes they get preferential treatment. But in this case, the parole board, he became eligible for parole. So this is not like parole that is granted under any kind of special conditions.
In fact, Correctional Services did say that they're going to ensure that there is no special treatment here and that the conditions are applied to as per any normal regular human who would be applying for being granted parole. You touch on several issues as we speak, and I'd like us to expand on how much confidence you have in the system. I say this because of what Reeva Steenkamp's mother had said about Oscar Pistorius, saying that she doesn't believe that he's been fully rehabilitated or shown any remorse, and also concern for the safety of other women because of his huge safety issues. But we know that there are very strict parole conditions which need to be adhered to here, and one of them does include attending courses or some form of conversation or psychology around anger management. Are you saying that you don't have any confidence in the system and that this man cannot be rehabilitated?
No, I am not saying that. So, as far as the justice process is concerned, he was eligible for parole, and so he's entitled to it. It is a right, you know. And so, sometimes when we speak about parole, it's sometimes in the same vein as how people get upset when people have been granted bail, and bail is also a human right. You know, so there are conditions that you need to fulfill, but most of the time the court will grant you, bail in the same way that they will grant you parole, unless there are all of these other things that say you should not be granted bail or parole, because these are kind of rights, that accused people and convicted people have. So, in terms of what it takes to rehabilitate people, and we know that we've got correctional services that really does not do that, they house people. And so there is a concern about what happens when people come out of prison.
Yes.
And so even this idea, some of these conditions do not really deal with what the issue is, because the issue of anger management, when you look at the basis of his conviction, the court does not say that he was angry at Reeva or whoever, it was. So it's about, where's this anger? Like, is this accepted as part of the problem that he has to address, So it's, if he's not been convicted because of that, so where does anger management kind of comes in? But the challenge that we have, and I think this goes back to the response that we have as a country on dealing with gender-based violence, is that in the National Strategic Plan we recognize that we need to prevent violence. So to the extent that people are saying that there may be other women who are at risk because of his of who he is, and whatever it is, because this is about trying to manage the public outrage and sentiment, right?
Yeah, so, since he's been barred from speaking to the media as one of the conditions.
So, but this is kind of a political move, right? Because even though the courts have not called this gender-based violence, and this was not the basis, of the conviction, people are calling it gender-based violence. And so that's why there is this idea that he needs to go and get anger management, and also the family and other people's activists as well, who are concerned about what it means to take a person that they believe is not rehabilitated back into society. But our duty to prevent violence, and I think this is one of the biggest things, because, with the National Strategic Plan that has got these 6 pillars that we have committed to as a country, to say if we do these 6 things, then we are going to turn things around when it comes to gender-based violence. The criminal justice system is often the last, line of defense, because as families we have failed, as individuals, we have failed, to control ourselves, our emotions. So the relationship between toxic masculinity that we see in this country all of these things that we see on social media is about women, you know, the gender stereotypes, the victim blaming, the slut shaming, you know, and all of those things which are the causes and consequences of gender-based violence. These are the things that we need to pay attention to if we want to be able to win. And sadly, this is one of the areas of work where there isn't a lot of interventions. I mean, we know that more recently the president had a summit really working with men in dealing with gender-based violence. But there is a lack of a political will and political commitment, because these summits that the presidents have called have really been nothing more than a public relations exercise. I mean, in November of 2022, you all went to Midrand. There was a summit, the second presidential summit on gender-based violence and femicide, and many people will be shocked to learn that a report of that summit still does not exist. And this was a summit that was intended to accelerate, right, the response, to hold those in power to account.
Yeah. What we also know is questions around the funds for gender-based violence, and you know, trying to curb and release funds for different NGOs and so forth to work and help women. That in itself, the track record is quite shocking from what we learned last year. President Ramaphosa has also called gender-based violence, especially at the height of COVID-19, a second pandemic. What are you saying when it comes to addressing the societal issues? I mean, you spoke quite a great deal about the impact on society and the perceptions of women and their roles in various communities and their homes, and how much work needs to be done in that space. Where do you think we're going as you speak about the political will, which is lacking in this regard?
We do need to have proper political, you know, commitment. And so the PR exercises are not taking us, you know, anywhere. We have a very good national strategic plan. It is a roadmap. And what we need to do is to really follow what is there. You have mentioned the issue of funding of the response, and there was a presidential fund that was there. Towards the end of last year, there was this National Council bill on gender-based violence and femicide that was passed by Parliament. And this is nothing but an ineffective piece of a legislation if it is passed. At the summit, there were very key things that we recommended, and there was an agreement that if the National Council on Gender-Based Violence is going to function effectively and efficiently, these are the things that would need to be included. After the summit, the report has not been released, and those things have not been included, you know, in this legislation.
Like what?
It is important that the fund itself, because now there is a private sector-led fund, is included in this legislation, because we live in a country that has got a serious trust deficit.
Yeah.
So for people to contribute resources, we need those resources to be in a place where people feel that there will be accountability should something actually go wrong. We need to have a clear line about how Treasury is dealing with resources, gender-based violence and femicide. We also have a bill that's really about national competence. But we do know that we need to be very clear about what the obligations of the provinces and the municipalities are, because this is a problem where everyone needs to be involved. At the moment, this has really been introduced in National Assembly and tagged as a Section 75 bill, and it does not really have provincial competence. These are all the things that came out at the presidential summit on gender-based violence and femicide that have been ignored by the presidency and the Department of Women, Youth and People with Disabilities.
Very concerning. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you short. And thank you for your time there as we try and get to the bottom of it, trying to find out what the problems are and why we are not moving forward when it comes to curbing the number of gender-based violence cases. Sibongile Ndashe there, Executive Director from the Initiative for Strategic Litigation in Africa. She's also a GBV activist.